Hello, and welcome to Episode 4 of the Grassroots Economic Organizing Podcast. This week, we have a conversation between Pamela Boyce Sims of the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub and Michael Johnson of GEO. Their conversation centers around the need for accountability and self-assessment in the cooperative solidarity economy, environmental and transition movements, as well as some suggestions for practices that we can apply as we attempt to evolve both our movements and ourselves. Enjoy the show.
Hello, this is Pamela Boyce Sims. I'm here with Michael Johnson. It is my pleasure and privilege to convene the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, which is a 6-state network of current and former transition towns in the geographic area from New York to Virginia. Transition towns are localities that deliberately move toward greater environmental resilience, and the network also includes other types of environmental initiatives and environmental activists. I'm going to invite my colleague Michael Johnson to introduce himself and the Grassroots Economic Organizing Collective. Michael?
Hi. My name is Michael Johnson. I am a member of the Grassroots Economic Collective. I've been for about 6 years. I'm co-author of a book on regional cooperative economics, building cooperative power, and also I have been involved in developing and sustaining a cooperative culture in an intentional community called Ghana in New York City.
We are going to have the pleasure, thanks Michael, of talking about the why of movement, self-awareness on an ongoing basis. Why do we need to self-evaluate, self-critique? How does that look? And how both of the very vast movements that we work with approach this. So I'm just going to start out with what seems to be, from an intellectual place, an obvious why. Why do we need to see clearly what's working, what isn't working, why whatever is happening is working for us or not, the origin, and so that we can be able to course correct, so that we can actualize our mission, so we can serve the greater whole, and how our movements with this kind of self-assessment process can grow and deepen the work. Now, we know this intellectually, but actually how that manifests in reality, in real time, is a whole other ballgame. So that's kind of where we're going to be going this afternoon as we have this discussion. I will just start out by saying that the movements that I'm working with are coming out of the Transition Towns movement. In this region, the Mid-Atlantic region from New York to Virginia, is moving more so towards the Great Transition, which is more of a framework for shifting consciousness and activity towards earth honoring as opposed to exploitive and extractive activity. And we do this against the backdrop of climate change and really uncertain times. So when, as an environmental activist, as a convener of a network of environmentalists, we're looking at unprecedented climate change and situations that we have never faced before. So self-assessment as a movement, self-critique as a movement is essential given the fact that this level of uncharted territory necessitates movements that are agile, that are considering the why of self-awareness in terms of a paradigm shift. What has worked before isn't going to necessarily work for us in the past. Old hierarchical power and control processes are outworn. Fluidity, and the transition movement always puts out there that it's a social experiment. It moves with whatever the emergent power dynamic arising in any given place is, the emergent need is, but we're doing this swimming upstream in a society that values fragmentation, hierarchy, power and control, and domination politics. So Our task is to manifest this social experiment that is fluid, that's moving with the uncertain times, that is flowing and responding to emergent needs. And it's my impression that there are challenges and difficulty in doing that. So I'm going to be diving into what those challenges look like. Why is it so difficult intellectually to know where we should be going in terms of self-assessment and critique, and how it actually happens or doesn't happen on the ground. So, Michael, I'm going to invite you to do the same for the economic solidarity, worker co-op movement, and give us some perspective on what you're experiencing.
Okay. Basically, I think the underlying dynamic that really affects everything is cultural, and we've grown up in a culture that, to a large extent, is very alien to cooperative solidarity economics and the kind of grassroots work that calls for. And so, from my perspective, one of the major tasks is for us to build a powerful cooperative cultures within the larger culture that we both embody because we've grown up in it and that we live in on a day-to-day basis. So a very key aspect of a cooperative culture, from my experience and from my perspective, is accountability. And this requires a lot of things. It requires that we really be able to hear each other, to talk with each other, and to build solidarity out of those kinds of deep conversations, and that those conversations can be transformative. Accountability, feedback, critiquing is an essential element if those conversations and those experiences of working together are going to be transformative. But for me, accountability is essentially speaking truth to each other so we can think together and make things work better. So in and of itself, accountability is very empowering. It's empowering in very essential ways. And we have a lot of problems achieving that within our various movements. And one of the core difficulties is that we fear accountability, because so often when we are trying to hold each other accountable and speaking truth to each other, it either winds up as some kind of an attack, or even if it isn't an attack, and then the usual thing is to defend yourself against the attack. Oftentimes, the speaking truth is not an attack, but it's experienced as an attack, and then the defense and counterattack. So this is this operates across the whole American culture, and probably most cultures to whatever extent I know about them. So we really need to find a way in which we can hold each other accountable in solidarity and for solidarity and for the movement's success. And that really is a big challenge. And it isn't, the sad thing is that I see very little sign about how essential this dynamic is. And there's very little attention given to learning how to make it work, making it real top priority.
Learning how to make it work. Absolutely. It is, I completely concur. It's the nuts and bolts of accountability, knowing how to speak truth. Again, just like the need to self-assess. Intellectually, it makes obvious, perfect sense. However, what is it that internally makes us experience that as attack? And as you put it very aptly, in American society, everything leads us away, or it's Western society, but especially in the United States with corporate capitalist thinking, everything leads us away from an inner life, self-examination, the din, the cacophony of Madison Avenue advertising and media and screens in front of our face all of the time. The fact that, as we talked about earlier on, it's the system itself is fueled by consumerism and rugged individualism, and which necessarily fragments us by class, by race, by interest group, by strata in competition for power and money. It's how the system works. When the industrial growth economy is working the way it is designed to work, we are splintered and fragmented. And then you add to that the cacophony of what a typical American is experiencing through the media and screens every single day. We do not look inside. We don't have that tendency. We don't have that proclivity because everything is moving in the opposite direction. So to experience truth-telling as something other than attack connotes a certain degree of self-mastery, being able to hold that information without picking up our toys and going away. If you can't do it my way, then I'm not going to participate. Automatically, that shuts down the conversation, shuts down the dialogue, and is indicative of going with the American flow of I can't consider what your needs might be. The possibility to listen deeply isn't there. And all of us individually, our inability or ability, the degree to which we can do that is the degree to which collectively our movements can do that. As in cooperative democratic movements, the hubs, the principles in the transition movement with a national hub that is a guiding or a hub, provides that hub factor. If in fact that is, again, it's individuals that can either hold the need for accountability and considering doing it another way, or not hold it. So it's really, in my estimation, a shift in consciousness that has to do with turning off the cacophony of what American corporate capitalist thinking would have us do and listen to an inner life and develop that. It doesn't have to have the S word, spirituality, attached to it. It's just an ongoing process of self-examination. Any thoughts on this, Michael?
Yeah, I'm very much with you on it. I would add two things. One is it's not just listening to my inner life, but that I'm trying to listen as well as possible to connect to your inner life so that I can really understand where you're coming from. Because often I'm reading what you're saying out of my context, and you're coming out of your context, which is very different. And I think, for example, it's the whole issue of race is very, very difficult for whites to understand that there's a whole other context there that they are very ignorant of. And the same thing with, the gender issue. So there's the whole great need to know that I need to know your context. And you need to know my context. And I think in very, very successful worker cooperatives or other kinds of alternative economic collectives, that's what they're able to do on at least a reliable basis that carries them from year to year to year to year. The second thing I would add to what you were saying is that there's very, very little appreciation for the fact that we have embodied all of the values and ideas and thinking and myths and practices of the culture we grew up in. We've done it in very unique ways. And so the service, accountability, and mutual feedback to each other is for us to catch how we are acting out of those values and those ideas. And then we can, it's like, oh, okay, all right, I got it, okay. And then you can start to think about it, and that feeds your self-awareness, my self-awareness.
Agreed. The ability to put oneself in, to step out of the arena of my context, your context, to be able to see as my acculturation comes over the horizon, your acculturation comes over the horizon, see those two systems of thought and the modus operandi there. Where do they intersect? Where does that intersection serve the greater whole as opposed to being completely immersed, whether it's class, race, gender, what have you, in your own set of lenses, and not only see your own, not inability to see your own lenses, inability to see someone else's lenses, inability to see where it intersects, subjective submersion, or even awareness of the need to see things at that level is where these movements get tripped up. And again, it's hard not to do that given the fact that our society moves in the direction of making certain that we don't see that. We're not paying attention to that, which is any cooperative, collaborative democratization of power in a network is going to have to swim upstream mightily in this particular way. In 2014, the Australian Simplicity Institute did a study of the transition environmental movement. It was about 8 years out in the movement's development at that point. It was critiqued for not concerning itself enough with social justice and not looking at exactly what you just articulated, Michael, not looking at the power dynamics of ethnicity, of race, of gender, of socioeconomic stratification that shape relationships. And after that critique came out, the overall movement, and this is in this country, the UK as a whole, the United Kingdom, which is where the movement began, is a whole other ballgame. They're dealing with a British DNA of small town, transition town mentality that has had a much deeper penetration than it has in the United States, and especially as it has in our corridor, the Mid-Atlantic corridor, which is a megacity corridor of cities the size of New York and Baltimore, D.C., Philadelphia, etc. But it hasn't been able to, our region, the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, has taken upon itself to internalize the accountability that the Simplicity Institute critique put in front of us. The larger movement in this country is having difficulty doing that, and it's actually even questionable whether the principals at the national level see the need for this kind of course-to-course correction in terms of outside of an occasional webinar, course correction in terms of social justice and the power dynamics of ethnicity, race, gender, and socioeconomic stratification. So that remains to be seen. In this region, we are taking it on and trying to work to evolve and refine the process of transitioning to a greater resilience, both in consciousness and in terms of activity. But it's really slow going because it means putting systems in place. So many networks think that, we all get along and it's just fine, and right now we're starting out with this gung-ho attitude, we can do this and we love each other and this is such a great cause, and don't take the time to put in place conflict resolution systems, communication systems, information flow processes, all of which are the glue for connecting with each other and hearing each other that allows for accountability. And recently it became really apparent that at the national level, those systems had never been thought out. And so we're now trying to do that at the regional level. So I'm just curious as to what you see in the worker co-op movement in terms of people embracing group process systems that will allow each other to hear themselves and hear each other, Michael.
Yeah, we have very much the same problem that you're talking about on the national movement of the transition movement, at the national level. I see there are two primary obstacles. One is that the whole area of cooperative education pays no heed to there being any need for our movement people to really learn to cooperate much more deeply than they do. They see no need to be advocating and promoting programs and projects and processes where people are continually learning to hear and to speak to each other. They're continually learning to self-reflect. They're continually learning to help come in where there is conflict. It's just ignored. I can't necessarily say totally because I'm not that totally informed. But for all practical purposes, there is no attention given to this kind of learning. And it's absolutely fundamental, and for all the reasons that we've already covered. So that's a major obstacle that is not even recognized. And when I'm talking about, programs and processes, I'm not talking about, one day of conferences or, weekend workshops or what have you. It's an ongoing, steady, constant process that keeps evolving and developing and experimenting. From my perspective, the second big obstructive factor in cooperative solidarity economic movement is we seem to have an obsession with building up to scale. Let's get big. This is our moment. If the financial, problems and all of the other crises we're in, people know things aren't working. This is our moment. Let's come in and really build the next system or the new economy or the cooperative growth ecosystem and all of these things. And I think exactly the opposite. We can't do that until we can really be cohesive with each other, that we can really be in solidarity, and that we're really grounded grassroots, and then you start moving, upward. We've never done this kind of work on any kind of large scale in this culture. You can go to Emilia Romagna and you can see what goes on there, but that's been going on for hundreds of years. That is not our culture. We can draw ideas from that area or from Quebec, but the American culture is radically different from both of those cultures. And we really don't factor in the limitations that imposes on us, both externally and internally, in terms of what we have, the practices and values that that we embody. And so we should at least be raising major questions, discussions, exploring, not is this working, is that working, so much as are we ready to do this? What are the traps that we're not seeing, et cetera, et cetera? And that the time and the energy and the money and the resources are going to that kind of, those kinds of projects. Very, very little of anything is going to, how do we learn to be really good with each other? How do we learn to think together and hear each other and really identify what's working and what isn't working and build from there step by step?
This obsession with building up to scale, let's get big, next system, new economy, bigger is better, is just so United States industrial growth economy. It's growth, growth, growth. Even as the new economy folks are talking about regenerative economy, gift economy, steady state economy, all the verbiage is there. But it just... And there's a whole dimension of the transition environmental movement as well as the great transition movement as well, that has to do with the new economy. The premise is that rather than try and reform or remold a system that is rotted to the core and about to fall, we step completely outside of that and create exactly what new alternatives. You're talking about the next system and new economy. We do a local resilience building piece and then connect all of these little robust, relocalized economies together in a whole web that's kind of like a root system underground that creates the alternative. However, big is always what we hear before, as you said, before there is a deep trust and willingness to be vulnerable and honest and tell the truth to each other, which takes, again, a tremendous amount of self-mastery. So all of the talk of the new systems, the next systems, etc., especially if you want to say left or socially progressive movements, again, this is just me speaking, it seems extremely intellectually brittle. Brittle in the sense that it is so cerebral and so theoretical and so, yes, this makes sense in our minds, but to open a deeper part of ourselves is absolutely to each other is absolutely terrifying for most people. I'm just curious, when you suggest that kind of not intellectual honesty, but openness to the vulnerability and trust that will create true cohesiveness and true accountability that holds the possibility of hearing the other person's suggestions. What kind of pushback do you get when you put that out there?
I don't get a lot of pushback. I just get no response.
No response at all. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and for example, well, it's very obvious to everybody listening that you and I are on the same page, and this is like a propaganda piece, so to speak. The thing is, though, please come to GEO and say, I have so many disagreements to what that Pamela and Michael were talking about. Give me a chance to do a podcast in response, or give me a chance to write, a comment on it and have that posted.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. Please. We want the dialogue. We're very hypocritical if we don't want the dialogue. If we're really missing something, tell us. Or if you've got questions that you don't think we're paying attention to, tell us. That's the whole point, is to generate that kind of dialogue. And so I'm really, really pretty serious when I put this kind of thing out. I generally get, nothing back.
I hear you.
A nod and say, "Oh yeah, I agree with that," and that's about the size of it.
Question: I'm going to just get really specific about how this lack of inner process, self-reflective process of the vast number of individuals in this particular environmental movement, transition towns, and the greater transition, which is a larger group of environmentalists, what that looks like in terms of how the model actually works, penetrates my region anyway, which is New York to Virginia, and what the fallout of that looks like. And I'm going to invite you to do the same because unlike in your situation, when you put this out there, and get silence back, when I put this out there, or people that are like-minded with me, I actually have gotten pushback, and I'm thinking it's my observation is because the nonprofit industrial complex doesn't want to rock the boat. And it's so seductive for a movement that really is visionary, absolutely visionary. The transition environmental movement and the Great Transition is patterned on closed-loop living systems, came out of permaculture. So it's about feedback. It's about being social experiments, a social experiment that morphs in accordance with the need of the whole, in accordance to systems theory. So it's horrible in my estimation that what has happened is the lure of a movement that's ahead of the curve, wanting to stay alive, therefore being seduced by the nonprofit industrial complex to not make any waves, is shooting itself in the foot by not being able to be the social experiment that it touts, even as it touts it to funders that they're wooing. So the way it looks the way that pans out in the region is what I call the pilot light phenomenon. Unlike the UK, where little towns and burgs and villages and hamlets do actually, this British DNA, these groups hang together for long periods of time, and John and Jane Q. Public, neighbor XYZ and friends come together, and they create a groundswell of activity. They move their little village or hamlet toward resilience systematically on all fronts, not just solar or renewable, but food and transportation, water, etc. In the UK, it seems to have a deeper impact. In this region, it has what I'm calling the pilot light phenomenon. People get gung-ho, really excited. They have no clue how to work in groups for all the reasons we've been talking about. Do not hear each other, battle each other. They dissolve, they evaporate. The groups dwindle to maybe two or three or four people. There may be sprinkled in there some actually robust transition initiatives, but by and large, this pilot light phenomenon is a function of not doing the inner reflection, the inner transition work. It's just like in a history book, there is that blue box on the side of a page of a chapter that has women's history or Asian American history or African American history, and it's in that blue box on the side of the page, never feathered in, never infused, never part of the overall history book. Inner self-reflection, inner process, the ability to self-critique is in that blue box. They call it inner transition on the side of the transition environmental page. And because of that, the sidebarring, these initiatives do not have the turgor, do not have the cohesiveness, do not have, against the backdrop of the whole industrial complex thinking, do not have the ability to go deeper. It stays a bunch of feel-good, nice projects of a specific demographic, and it stays there. It never penetrates deep into the fabric of any given locality in most instances. Now, those pilot lights are important because when the climate stuff hits the fan, when it really dials up and we've got all kinds of stuff hitting the fan, the people in those little towns are going to remember, oh, there was a transition initiative here, and they'll run to the pilot light, and then the groundswell might happen. But in the interim, they're just flickering pilot lights out there because there isn't this framework of going deeper into who we are and not being terrified of our inner selves and what we might find if we actually looked there. And these initiatives remain cerebral and disconnected, feel-good types of things. That's what it looks like in our region, with the exception of a few really die-hard groups that have stuck with it in the region, and they're penetrating a bit deeper. But basically, without doing what we're talking about, the movement is shooting itself in the foot, but it's terrified to do that. And the how-to is the strategies are where I'd like to go next. I'm wondering, you can invite people, Michael, to be part of this, come talk about a variant opinion or what they're actually seeing. What strategies do you have for reeling people into the conversation or wooing them into this conversation? What strategies are you putting in place?
Well, I mean, in a very overall way, I'm proposing in fact, I'm even writing a book, but I also have a general framework that I put out several times, and I'll keep on putting it out, which is it's basically a cultural approach. And so the value of that, I think, is that one can see that the problem we're talking about, and I think pilot light is a great image, that people can say, yeah, that is a real problem. And how can we go about addressing it? Now, in the alternative economic movement arena, I think, for example, there's a very important, big, significant project called the Evergreen Cooperative in Cleveland, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And as far as I can tell, which is the information about it is not all that available, particularly stuff that we know. So my information is limited. But anyway, I can totally believe, and I feel like I'm almost certain that the developers of this were seeing the pilot-like problem, and we said we've got to do something that really takes them a chunk, but not too big a chunk. So they focused on the inner city area of Cleveland and developed this model, or designed a model. Now, if they had this is where the kind of practical thinking I think it needs to happen. If they had kept in mind from the very beginning, this is an experiment. Therefore, we need ways to evaluate this, and it can't be internally. This is something that's really important to the whole movement. We need to bring the movement into it, because there's many risky things we're doing here. There's many things we don't even know quite what to do. And if they had structured from the very beginning an ongoing dialogue with people from the movement to get input, to get new ideas, to get reflections on the mistakes they made from people outside who are really invested in its success. And that's really an important element. Because a lot of the criticism that comes from people who aren't invested in the success. They've got their own trips that they're running. But if that had been an essential element in the original design, then the information would have been moving back and forth into the movement, across the movement, back to Evergreen, et cetera, identifying what's working, what's not working. It's the basic kind of thing that happens in science and in business. They have a whole network of ways in which people confer with each other. Mm-hmm. So, and particularly, if a project like that is going to get caught in the nonprofit industrial complex. So, what signs, what alert signals can we set up so that in the broad base of people are paying attention and can push the button and say, wait a minute, where are you going with this? Because we're all liable to go, the nonprofit industrial complex is an American cultural phenomenon, at least mm-hmm. American. I don't know about the other countries. Mm-hmm. And that's embodied in each one of us. We want to go for the brass ring. We want, all of the elements of that are personal as well as collective and social. And, it's like, how do we watch out for each other? Those kinds of invitations, that kind of framing isn't part of our culture yet. So, for me, another example would be cooperative education. How do you individually, collectively, or like a GEO, address the cooperative education people in the movement to say, guys, we have to learn how to cooperate with each other. It's a profound need, but you've got nothing to offer us. Where can we start on this? And then it's a wonderful thing is to do whatever support we can for any local projects, small projects, et cetera, that are doing this kind of work, which is basically research work, and then to be able to help them connect with each other so they can talk, well, we're doing this, or we're using this process, we're getting these results, and so that they can be conferring with each other. That requires time, that requires energy, that requires money, that requires resources. But no one is talking about those kinds of projects, either at a local level where you bring them together where they can learn from each other, or in a significant scale, or on the large scale like the Evergreen Project. I hope that was all clear.
Could that perhaps be where the GEO collective goes? The establishment, the modeling of how we confer with each other, what does deep communication look like? Not just vibrating vocal cords that's landing on stony ground and not fertile ground, but true communication, mind melding so we see the other. What do systems look like when that's in place? GEO might be a standard bearer, potentially, in the movement. I'm saying that because from my vantage point for the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, this is something that if we don't see it, if we don't see it happening, we recognize the need and we don't do it, we are culpable. So therefore, I'm throwing that out to GEO in the same way I throw it out in the region I put it on the table in the region here. I love the idea of the welcoming idea of how do we watch out for each other. That is so beautifully said. What signs and signals do we use to alert each other when there's a need for course correction? Where are the red flags in this process? And let's love each other. First of all, the reason why I keep bringing it back to self is if you do not have compassion for yourself, you basically are incapable of extending compassion to another person in your small group, in your large group, in your network, etc. So it does begin with self. So that self-reflective piece, development of one's own inner life is imperative. But in order to watch out for each other, as you've just said, and put in place these ways of conferring and make sure the red flags pop up instantly when we're going down the wrong path. Someone's got to take the lead. The lead has to come from the people who get it. Collaboration, cooperation, compassion, democratization of power, all of those are rooms, pathways that don't freak people out because you're not using the S word, the spiritual word. You're just basically saying, this is what's going to get us through the eye of the needle, people. If we don't relate to each other this way, it doesn't matter how many solar arrays and how many community gardens and how many co-ops we've got. If we can't get to this level of communitarian thinking, we are not going to be, it's going to be more excruciating, and it's going to be really hard to get through the eye of the needle of climate change, resource depletion, and economic instability, which is going to be contraction and collapse at some point. The eye of the needle is staring us in the face at this point. And I often say to folks in Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, every philosopher from Plato to Gurdjieff to Du Bois has always talked about where activists can constructively direct their energy. All of these philosophers, and you can find it in so many other places in addition to these folks, have said there's at any given point in time on the planet, 80% of the people are here as wonderful placeholders for the evolution of this wonderful Gaia, of the being that is Gaia, and really don't want to hear what we're saying in this podcast. They're simply not interested. But we, as activists, we put the buffet in front of people. I mean, Congress is one of those groups. We put the buffet in front of people, the 80%, and then we let it go. We don't slam our head against the brick wall because our heads will be bloodied and bludgeoned. Who needs that? So you put the buffet there and say 80%, here it is, make a dish out of it, take a dish off the table or not. And then there are the people that are actively listening to this podcast and are in the 10% that are the cutting edge, like the GEO folks moving people forward, or the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub, hopefully. And then there's the threshold, that 10% of folks there that if you put the buffet in front of them, they might pick up the dish and gravitate toward the GEO folks, or they might slide into the 80% that's extremely important, doing their role for Gaia and the evolution of the planet, and that's cool. But that threshold is how we keep from slamming our heads against the brick wall and offer the kinds of strategies that you put out there. And I want to get your thoughts about that. And then I want to talk about culturally relevant pathways into this work, because the transition environmental movement, which is why I came up and out through that movement toward the Great Transition, is a group of people who is predominantly middle-aged to elder, white, middle class, and upper middle class, post-materialist, highly educated people, and you can count on two hands the number of people of color that have been retained over time in this movement, given the cultural lenses through which it is executed. So that's where I'd like to go. But what do you think about the threshold, folks, Michael? And I just so totally applaud your red flag and alert thing and taking care of each other.
I think we're caught in a very interesting conundrum. For a collective or a region or a network or a whole movement to set up red alert systems, subsystems, means they have to be convinced that they're needed. And it's very difficult to see that they're needed when, to a large extent, people feel very threatened by accountability and feedback. So there's a whole educational process that has to go on in which people begin to see the value of it. And that doesn't happen overnight. And I'm reminded of my own story in that when we started our experiment here at Ghana, the community that I've been part of for 36 years, I was gung-ho. Yes, this is what we got to do. We really got to learn how to talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And boy, when the rubber hit the road, and all of a sudden I was finding myself maligned, which I wasn't. That was how I was receiving the criticism. That can't be me. The difficulty of learning how to step back and take in the red alerts that people were giving me. And it was the same to other people as well. It's a real piece of learning. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way in which I had to learn to have compassion for myself, because I was punishing myself all, week after week, or punishing other people because it wasn't going the way I thought it should go. And then there's an element of which we need to have a great deal of compassion for everybody in the movement and the fears that they have about criticism and feedback and accountability. And if all of us don't have that kind of compassion for the challenge of this difficulty, and that if it's going to happen in a really substantial way, it's going to have to be step by step. It's going to have to be people really listening to each other. It isn't going to happen. And we're at a point where it may take a long time to really persuade the movement as a whole that this is very, very essential. Take a long time to convince the cooperative education people that you've got to transform the whole thing you're doing. To convince the people who are into the moving towards scaling up that slow down. There's big questions to ask here. But if we're very consistent in voicing those concerns and those ideas, and walking the talk as well, and modeling and constantly inviting people's, different thinking and criticism, and hearing it and listening to it, as well as we can. That's the way in which it's going to move forward, I think. And as mistakes happen and people see that somehow we're off base, if that voice of people who are really concerned with developing accountability and red alerts so that we're empowering each other in the whole movement, if that voice is there consistently and building and even beginning to understand the whole thing a lot better than we understand it today, that, I think, is going to have impact. And I guess my major struggle with that is the patience. I tend to be a very impatient person, and so I'm always having to step back and go, okay, what's happening? But that persistence in the face of we're dealing with a lot of resistance, but to persist anyway, and to keep promoting and keep trying to enhance those kinds of processes.
It's persistence and a tremendous amount of courage on the part of, if you look at these movements as a totality, because in the case of the environmental movement, rather homogeneous group of people are having difficulty with self-critique and self-evaluation and self-assessment. Just add the other layer of cultural diversity, socioeconomic diversity, gender issues. If people feel threatened and intense discomfort in examining and doing self-reflection amongst themselves, quadruple that to the 2,000th power when you introduce the concept that women may have to actually caucus among themselves. I saw this happen in the permaculture movement, for example, caucus among themselves and bring to the larger table of the movement the patriarchy that is manifest in the power and control politics of what is supposed to be a democratic movement based on living systems. I saw that happen in the permaculture movement, from which the transition movement was born. Or when African Americans decide, okay, this is a social experiment, let us get together and see if we can devise amongst ourselves a culturally relevant pathway into an environmental conversation so that we're not coming to sit at your table. We are setting our own table, or women are setting their own table, or people of a certain socioeconomic affinity are setting their own table, and then once they develop robust movements amongst themselves in their own caucus, then coming to the larger movement table and saying, hey, we feel really strong now. We're not operating from you don't have to give us that noblesse oblige kind of patronizing tap on the head. We feel as in our truth as you do, because we've had the opportunity to meet amongst women or meet amongst African Americans. When I have witnessed in the environmental movement, specifically the Transition Town movement, the threat that produces to the mainstream momentum of this movement is tantamount to terror. What are these people coming to tell us? This is not the way it is done. They're supposed to be, quote, stakeholders at our table. That adds a whole other layer of complexity to the avoidance of self-reflection, even amongst the mainstream folks. So there's a tremendous amount of work in front of us. It's juicy work, it's substantive work, it's excruciating work sometimes. But as you said, Michael, it's all about persistence, one foot in front of the other. What do the demographic pieces look like in the worker cooperative movement or the solidarity economy movement?
I can't speak to that a whole lot because I haven't really been that focused, So I would just be, in terms of the movement, I would just be speaking from my own deep personal experience, et cetera, of
go for it.
Class and sexism, et cetera. But I was very struck by one thing that I witnessed. GEO put on its third advancing development of worker cooperatives, and we got into a discussion of race. And the discussion started with a black woman saying, "I have this white man in the place where I work, and he's constantly trying to understand, what my experience is as a black person, and I just find the whole thing very, very difficult to handle. I don't know. I just don't know what to do about it because it just seems." It takes so much time, and et cetera. And it was a real legitimate problem. And in the course of the brief discussion around it, there was a black man who came into the conversation, and he said, "I've gotten to the point to where I am willing to sit down and spend whatever time it takes with any white person who genuinely wants to understand what they're not getting." And he said that's where we need to be going is in to that degree that those who aren't getting us, whoever the us is that when there's someone who is genuinely asking, what am I not getting, and to be there to have for that kind of conversation.
That's interesting, and because there are a couple of schools of thought on that. I'm really pleased that that guy was able to do that. More often than not, the other school of thought is it's when people of color or women or people of a certain socioeconomic background take on the teacher role, the re-traumatization is almost of the person taking on that role is almost inevitable. Dealing with whites who don't get it. However, if there are people who step up, it falls into the whole category of incessant racial microaggressions, microassaults, all that entire line of thinking. So, in quote diversity work, people have stopped asking folks to step up and do that because of the inevitable re-traumatization. But that does not mean people like that gentleman who's so selflessly martyred himself to do that shouldn't do that. I think it's wonderful if people take that on. I think at some point in the lives of people of color, that role arises, and if you have the energy and the stamina, you can do it. But by and large, it is draining, and it's definitely problematic. But there are lots of just the idea of considering how we might approach these questions is powerful in and of itself. Just stepping back from
absolutely.
But anyway,
I just wanted to come in. I couldn't resist. Absolutely, we just want to entertain the question. That's the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Let's wind this down. Do you have some final thoughts to offer? We're about at time. On the conversation today?
I guess there's a level of satisfaction that that I wasn't expecting, or kind of satisfaction that I wasn't expecting, and that is that we have given so much attention to the difficulty of this problem being recognized. And that it's going to be a slow, steady march, to advocate that attention being given to it, because it's not until attention is given to it that the resources won't come until that happens, and that's that persistence is the work,
Mm-hmm.
and my impatience keeps telling me, oh my God, this is too much, give up. But then it's this kind of conversation comes back to, it is difficult, but that's the name of the game. That's the name of the game for the whole movement in terms of what it's trying to do. We're in a very alien culture, so it takes a lot of persistence, and rethinking and learning and growing up, et cetera. And I'm so glad that the difficulty of the challenge comes through. And we're not in the saying, you should do this, you should do that. Oh, well, we do say that.
Yeah. I second the motion on persistence and recognizing, for me, the difficulty is the juicy stuff on which we cut our teeth. The challenge, regardless of how excruciating it is, that is the stuff of growth and evolution. And if we didn't have that, we would be, stagnate. We'd be in a stagnation pool. The entire point is to have what stretches us, what makes us grow. And I welcome the challenge coming over the horizon at this point, and as I convene all of these fabulous people in the Mid-Atlantic region, that's kind of where our minds are at this point. And I know that I myself am a suspect. It really is the collective getting it. It doesn't have to be a massive number of people, just the tipping point of a collective or a group of people that model that and keep bringing themselves back to the need to engage with the challenge on behalf of the whole is just extremely exciting, frankly. It's just downright exciting. So I throw out that challenge to the Mid-Atlantic Transition Hub all of the time, and we kind of bounce it off of each other. I offer that challenge as well to the Grassroots Economic Organizing Cooperative Collective as well, and onward and upward, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation as well.
Me too, Pamela.
This has been a production of GEO, Grassroots Economic Organizing. Find us on the web at geo.coop.